So Marina's question was, are there alien life forms or life forms on other planets, shall we say, that are of higher development than ourselves? Right. Now, if I had some faith in God, what would I believe about the universe? Because it's a pretty big universe, isn't it? So if I had some faith in God, yes?
That it's abundant?
That it's abundant with life. And we see that on Earth, don't we? We see life everywhere on Earth, and if man hasn't poisoned it, we see more of it, of course. But we see a huge amount of abundant life on Earth, and therefore we could assume that we see stars in the sky, and we know those stars are suns, and there's billions of them, and in fact there's far more than billions of them. We could then assume that there must be obviously other planets surrounding these particular suns, and therefore potentially an abundance of life of all types of forms in all of these, in this universe that we live in. And if we had any examination, faith causes us to examine where we are. So we examine our world and we go, yes, there's lots of life on our world, and there's lots of types of intelligent life, right away from humans, and some would argue that we're not as intelligent as other things, but from humans down to the smallest of life that can be experienced on Earth, there is intelligence in the whole lot of it. So then we can assume that there must be intelligence somewhere else as well, other than just on our Earth. It would make sense, would it not? So faith would also dictate in this question that we're now starting to go, okay, the chances of there being life forms on other planets are fairly high. It's got to be fairly high given the fact that if we look at our Earth, we can see the abundance of life forms, and we can see that we are just one planet in one solar system surrounding one sun, and there's billions and trillions of those particular things going all around the universe. We can then basically assume that there must be forms of life on other planets. Now that doesn't mean it's humans. It could be there could be microbes, or there could be a range of different life on different planets. And when I get to answer the question properly from my own experience, I'll tell you what is there. But what I'm trying to help you do here is to reason your way through the answer using the 5 basic things. Right? And if you have any faith at all, and the way you gain faith is by looking at what you have in front of you and then basing probability upon what you have in front of you, then you could see that faith would determine that there's probably life forms on other planets, wouldn't it? It's pretty unlikely that it's not, in fact. And so before you even discover that there is through your own experience, you could basically assume there is just from looking at what you see on Earth and having some faith that God has created abundantly. You assume basically that there must be some kind of life on other planets. Can you see that? And so the presumption that there's not is actually a lack of faith in God's abundance. So those people who feel that there isn't life on other planets basically have a lack of faith in God's abundance. Because if we assume God is an abundant God, and God creates this large variety of life, we can also then assume that with a high degree of probability that there must be life elsewhere. Okay. Now, how do I find out whether there is? See, most people go, okay, what do I do now to try and discover life on these other planets? Well, what has man done? You think about what man has done already. What have we done to discover whether there's life on other locations in the universe? We've created spaceships, we've created probes, and we've sent them out into the universe with cameras and other detection equipment that eventually some of them have actually landed on other planets in our solar system, and they've sampled different parts of the solar system attempting to find this life. Now, why has man done that? because the average scientist has faith that there must be. He wouldn't spend billions of dollars and all of his life sending out a probe to another planet if he didn't believe in his own heart that there's got to be life there somewhere, would he? Right? So it's very interesting that even the average scientist, if you like, has faith that the universe is abundant. Yeah? So faith is a very important quality to develop if we're ever going to discover anything new about the world we live in and ourselves. So we've sent out all these probes. What's the answer been so far? Does anyone know? We don't know. The answer is no, there's not yet been the discovery of life. But if you think about it, let's look at the universe itself. It's hard to draw a diagram of a universe on a whiteboard, but let's just look at it from our perspective, where there's our solar system, and in amongst the rest of the universe, that doesn't rate any mention whatsoever, does it? It's like a pinprick in the universe in which we live. And the closest star, does anyone know how far that is? The closest sun to us? Right. So if we had to draw it in terms of the expanse of the universe, it's not to scale here, but let's say it's that far away. It's around 8 light years. What does that mean? It means that travelling at the speed of light, it would take you 8 years to get there. And in fact, it means the light from that sun takes 8 years for us to see it. Right? Now, what's the speed of light? Can any of you... So 186,000 miles per second. That's pretty quick. And travelling at that speed, it would take you 8 years to get to that closest star. Now, remember, there's trillions and trillions and trillions of these stars. In fact, they actually believe there's billions of galaxies, let alone stars. Right? So if we look at the fact that there's billions of galaxies, most galaxies are separated by distances anywhere up to hundreds and hundreds and sometimes tens of thousands of light years, just one galaxy to the other galaxy. So this is a huge universe in which we live, right? But travelling at that speed, it takes us 8 years to get to our nearest star. And as yet, there's not been any Earth-based ship or anything that has been able to travel at that speed. Because what's our travel of speed in space? Do you know at the moment what it is? Do you know how fast the shuttle travels? No? Okay. I think it's around anywhere, it ranges, but anywhere from 18,000 miles per hour. Right? Now, that's miles per second. And travelling at that speed would take 8 years. Imagine travelling at this speed, miles per hour, how many years it's going to take for any probe we send to get to the nearest star. So, and the problem is when we get there, it might not be there anymore. Because the light took 8 years to get to us, and that light is still travelling, and it could still travel even while the source of the light has now disappeared or been converted into some other kind of matter. So we can travel all that distance and still not find it because it might not be there after all that time that we spent. So can you see, if we are going to find out about the universe in terms of an experiential way while we're living on Earth, we are going to have to develop methods of transportation that are faster than light. That's our only option. Right? Now, there are scientists working on that, working on trying to find methods of travel that will be faster than light travel. Now, there are scientists who don't even believe it's possible to travel faster than light, because what they've found is the faster you propel an atom through space, the closer it gets to light speed, the closer it gets to that speed, 186,000 miles per second, the heavier it gets. And it gets so heavy that eventually they can actually shoot particles through a gravitational accelerator at close to those speeds. But the particles are so dense and heavy that they penetrate more than 8 feet thick of lead before they slow down. That's how heavy and how much force they have. And in fact, you have here in the States, and there's also one in Europe, large gravitational magnetic accelerators just doing particle physics examinations to try to find out how to get beyond the speed of light. And your government and the European government spend huge amounts of money trying to do this every year. You can see why, because they have some faith that there is life out there, but they know that the only way they're going to find it is by being able to travel faster than light. Because if you travel as slow as light, the average person's lifetime isn't long enough to discover anything. So they know that it's going to have to happen a lot faster. Now, when you die, of course you don't really ever die, but when you die, you're now in your spirit body. In your spirit body, you're not constrained by the same types of examinations of life, right? So in your spirit body, you are able to travel faster than light. And in fact, every celestial spirit, a person who's developed in love to the point of becoming at one with God, travels faster than light. Okay? That means that they can examine the universe with a lot more clarity and a lot more speed than we can here on Earth. So in your future existence, after you've passed and you've become at one with God through a process that you've already learned about, you will be able to examine the truth about the universe in which we live. And you'll be able to go to the nearest star and to the nearest planets that have life and examine them. You'll be able to see them for yourself and therefore experience them. Does that make sense? And this is all possible because you are now no longer limited by the physical form, and you now, because you're in the spirit form, you now are not having the same physical limitations. So the answer to the question is, once you become a spirit, you will be able to, for yourself, no matter what happens here on Earth over the next thousands of years in the discovery of faster than light travel, you will, for yourself, once you become a spirit, be able to answer that question. Now, is the answer to that question valid to you right now, is my next question. So if we hand the mic back to Marina, how is the answer to the question valid for you right now? Does it change your life if you know there are aliens?
Significantly, no. No, but it, in terms of development, like being us created in God's image, like I have the image thing is like planted into my brain, like image, like we look like Him, like human form.
Yeah,
and
that's
what's
not
out
the
there,
case.
yeah, and what's out there could be totally like different. And I guess, you know, these are all ways that I'm guessing of like the valid ways. I just probably should have been a scientist and I'm not, but it's just in terms of that. I guess I just try to find logical ways for God's existence when I don't feel that God's there, I guess.
So how does the existence of an alien species confirm God's existence, logically?
Oh, just like the qualities and attributes, just from myself, like for what humans are on Earth. Just, I guess, yeah, there's like that incongruency of like what is, if we're created in His image, what is the image? Is this the word image something different than what I've been raised to think?
Yes, so can you see now from a logical perspective, you're now distorting the reasoning of your own logic. So can I give you an illustration?
Sure. Yeah.
You're saying this statement, God created man in His image,
Right.
'in God's image, 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 ' it's talking about there. Now, where did that statement come from? From the Bible.
Bible.
Yeah, it came from the Bible in Genesis chapter 1. Right. Now, what is the Bible?
Something man wrote.
Something man wrote, okay, so it's man's writings. Now, when man wrote that, was there any man who actually had talked to God, like one-on-one, seen God, any of these kind of things?
Aside from yourself, no, probably
No?
not.
Okay. So can you see it was not only man's writings, but it was also man's assumption. Now, I think it's a valid assumption. I'm not saying it's not a valid assumption, but it is an assumption, right? And then what you're doing with this assumption here, you've now made an extension with that from a logical perspective somehow into, okay, I don't know what that means. Well, it's for a start, it's a man's assumption, but you're now saying, you're now assuming that it's right.
I understand what you mean, yeah.
Right, so you're now having to assume that that statement is right. So there's another assumption, and then when you make so you want to believe it's correct or it's right or it's true, right? That's what you believe, and then you make another assumption. I don't know what that means, and so what I want now from God is some kind of proof that that's true. But now you're wanting from God proof that a man's assumption is true. Do you see what I'm saying? From a logical perspective, is that the right way to approach any question?
No.
Because it's just a begins from an assumption.
It also shows I'm not very humble when I ask that, like lack of humility a little.
Yeah, you don't need to condemn yourself for any of those things. It's just not logical. What you're doing is not logical. And then what you're doing is you're saying, okay, because that's an assumption and I don't understand the assumption, you're now going into the state, well, okay, now what I want from God is some alien life form to appear to me so that I can know for truth that if their character is like God's and my character is like God's, like, are our forms different or are our forms the same? If our forms were different, what would it prove?
Well, it would make that statement wrong about his image.
Would it, though?
Oh, I guess
It would only make it wrong from a physical
human,
perspective,
yeah, I
would
see
it?
what you mean, yeah.
Not from a spiritual perspective or a soul-based perspective. It would only make it wrong from a physical perspective. In other words, like there is this assumption in all of that man, like God is, what's the word? There's a word for a belief that God looks like a man. Anthropomorphic God, isn't it? Right? So there's a belief that God is anthropomorphic, right? Now, that's probably not a very good assumption either, right? Given the fact that God would have to be far more powerful than we are, given the fact that if God created the universe, God would have to have probably far more power and therefore probably couldn't be contained in the same body that we have.
Yeah, that makes sense, because if I sit and I think about like flowers and colors and things that God created, it shows how multifaceted and like there's so much more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And so we can't then assume that God looks like a man. So, but that doesn't mean that this God created man in his image isn't true. It could be just true in a different way than we're assuming from a physical perspective, right? Couldn't it?
I never thought of that before, but yeah.
Yeah. So this is our problem with making assumptions from men, other people, and then basing the discovery of truth on these assumptions. It's not the great way to discover truth. And to be honest with you, most scientists know that. Right? They only usually base their assumptions on things that have been proven to be true to them through some kind of experiment, and then they make further assumptions which they try to then prove to be true. But they don't make assumptions just based on assumptions that have no proof or no underlying proof that nobody can supply. They don't do that. So our desire to do that is very flawed from the beginning. So when you go down the track of going, okay, if I saw an alien standing next to me and I saw they had a different body, then what does that say about that statement?
It's false.
Well, only from a physical perspective it says
From
it's
physical.
false.
Ah,
So it doesn't really say anything. It doesn't prove anything. Do you see? So when I hear questions like, do aliens exist? And while I know they do, I don't see much point to the question from a logical perspective in terms of developing your faith in God. Does that make sense? The reality is there's 6.5 billion, or 7.2, I think, at the moment, billion people on this planet who are highly intelligent at different times of their life. And if that's not proof enough that there is intelligence in the universe, then I don't think an alien standing next to them is going to help the situation. Does that make sense? But I will answer your question.
I think you are answering in like a indirect sort of fashion.
What I'm trying to help you do is to look at what emotionally drives the questions that we ask. And a lot of time what emotionally drives questions that we ask is assumptions based on other people's statements that are also assumptions.
I guess it's like the lesson to not really listen to what others say unless I investigate certain things for myself, or maybe be a little more open-minded, I think.
Yeah, but I wouldn't agree that the answer is to not listen to what other people say. I listen
That's
to what
true, because I'm listening to what you're saying.
I listen to what everybody says. Right? The key then is to analyse it using both your mind, the capacity of your intellect, but also analyse it from the point of view of love and from the point of view of faith and the point of view of these other things that we've listed here. And then you can come to certain conclusions which will be only assumptions until you have proven them to be true. The problem is on Earth, we want to know things before we go through that process, personally. That's our problem most of the time. We want somebody else to do all the work and then just tell us the answer. And a relationship with God is not possible that way. Somebody else can't do all the work and then you get a relationship with God. Right? And this is one of the biggest false beliefs on this planet, that you can actually have a relationship with God through somebody else doing all the work of discovery for you. You can't. Your personal relationship with God is only possible when you do the work. And you're going to have to do the work if you really want to know. Just like if you wanted to play the piano, would you go like, Marina, you want to play let's say you wanted to play the piano. You come up to me and say, AJ, you go and play the piano. So I go off and play the piano. It takes me 8 years. And I learn how to play the piano. And I come back and how has that benefited you in playing the piano?
Not at all.
Well, there's only one way it's benefited you. And that is you could learn from me what I learned from somebody else.
Teach me,
That's the only way, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually help you if you don't do anything yourself, does it? I've enjoyed playing the piano for 8 years. I've gone through the process of learning. I've gone through the process of discovery, but you haven't done all of those things. So who is going to play the piano in 8 years' time? I am. And you're still not going to be able to play the piano, right? And this is exactly the same with our relationship with God. If you expect somebody else to do all the work for you, in the end, they are the one who's going to have the relationship with God, but you're still going to be without one. That's reality. Your relationship personally with God can only happen through your personal effort, through the work you do. And of course, through God's desire to have a relationship with you. That's the only way it's going to happen. And it doesn't matter how many people you ask to do all the work for you, in the end, no matter what work they do for you, it's not going to benefit you. Except in one way, and that is that they can show you what they did by teaching you something. But that's the only way it's going to benefit you. In the end, only you can make the shift. So for example, me telling you the answer to your question, is there alien life forms of higher intelligence or just as much intelligence as ourselves on other planets? Me saying yes to you, which is the actual truth, how does that help you?
Well, I guess at the end of the day, I still have to figure that out for myself, whether it's true or not, just because you're telling me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it doesn't help you at all.
But I have a tendency to believe you in a lot of the stuff you say, too.
But that's crazy. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
Why
Because
would
I
you do
guess I feel like just my own notions are invalid sometimes, and there's just someone else, and that's just my own feelings that I have to feel through, of course.
Yep.
That, you know, someone else, like the man, knows something more than me and things like that.
But I don't believe everything you say.
Yeah, which is good. I wouldn't want you
So
to
why do
believe
you
me.
believe everything I say?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
why is that? It's
Right.
crazy to do that. Why would you do that?
No, I just guess if some of the things that you've taught have resonated with me, and
You've discovered them through your own personal
Right,
experience
right.
to be true.
right.
That's the only reason for believing anything that I say is through your own personal experience, discovering it to be
Yeah.
true.
That's what I said earlier to Corner, you have been the only person that has had the more similar, or have expressed the more similar ideas than what I have always felt in my life, and that's why I've continued to follow this path, you know, in
Yes.
poor manner sometimes, but yeah. That's
But in the end, you trusting what I say without doing something yourself is not going to benefit you, as you know. Yeah. And this is what I'm really getting at. So if we go back to the question, is there alien life forms on other planets? My answering the question in the affirmative, yes, there is, does not benefit you at all. You still don't know whether that's true. You still don't know whether it's just my own assumption, my own opinion. You haven't had my experience where I've gone to have a look at them. So you haven't been able to do that at this point. So you don't, and you don't even know whether that experience of mine is just a part of my imagination or whether it's actually real. Does that make sense? So this is the problem with some of the questions that we ask, is that we often get ourselves like pulled away from the basic principles that we need to discover first. So while we ask ourselves questions about life forms on other planets, you know, all these different things that are similar in nature to that, while we're asking all of those things, we're really distracted from those 5 primary things that we need to really understand. The beauty of asking questions about these primary things is that they will help you understand logically what questions are worth asking and what questions are not really worth asking at this point. Does that make sense? So while I'm living here in a physical life, myself asking a question about whether there's alien life forms on other planets has very little bearing on my personal life. It has very little bearing on my personal happiness. It has very little bearing even on my trust in God and faith in God, actually. Because in the end, no matter who answers me and whoever says it to me, unless they can provide physical evidence and proof that their answer is correct, it's pretty much pointless having the discussion. Can you see that?
Thanks for taking the time to explain that.
Now, what I'm suggesting is that this is where we're often distracted from logic. We become distracted from logic. What I'm suggesting first is, if we develop these qualities first, we focus all of our effort and time and attention on developing these things first, all the other answers will come to you. Now, isn't that what was said in the Bible, isn't it? And that is an actual quote of something I did say, and that is, all these other things, seek first God's kingdom, and all these other things will be added to you. Now, many of us still don't understand that statement, because what do we do in our life? We seek first everything else other than God's love, and then we expect to know the answers to all of these other things. And we can't know them without seeking first these things. Does that make sense? So, yes, in terms of a brief answer to your question now, yes, there is life on other planets. No, they don't look like anything other than humans. In other words, they don't look like, you know, some two-headed monster they all have a soul, these life forms. But there are also other types of life, just like on Earth we have other types of life other than human life, that range right the way down to single-celled life, right the way up to the human soul. And that is the case on all of these other planets as well. When God makes the human form, God thought the design was pretty good and looks pretty pleasant And so therefore decided to make that design in other locations. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you know how myself and Mary have been watching Star Trek lately, Star Trek Enterprise, and you know how there's all these life forms that are all very complicated and all these different forms of evolution. The reality is the way God designed the evolutionary process is that it's, as God adds love to the system, every single evolutionary process is perfected and therefore results in the same result in the end. So while there are other types of living creatures, like other types of insects, for example, on other planets, that we don't have here on Earth, when it comes to the human life form, the very highest of God's creations, which is not the actual human body, but rather the human soul, the human soul is very, very much the same everywhere in the universe that you go. Does that make sense? But me saying all that means nothing to you. Because it doesn't, there's no way at the moment that I can verify that to you by providing further evidence. There's no way that I can get one of those people to visit you because they have the same problem with how fast we travel as what we have going there. And so we are all got physically the same limitations at this point in time. And as a result of those kind of things, it's impossible for somebody to actually provide the physical proof. Now, the question then comes, well, where does all these things like, you know, people saying that they've had experiences where they've been snapped up by aliens and they've been experimented on, or, you know, they have all those kind of things. Now, there are very clear explanations that we can give about all of those particular subjects. And but I don't know whether that's highly important in terms of our time today and tomorrow as to whether you want to know all of those kind of things. But the reality is there is an answer to all of those questions. As you would expect from a God who wants to love his children, he wants to give answers to all of his children on every subject possible. That's what you would expect, isn't it? So in the end, you should be able to almost ask any question and get a definitive answer with that question. Now, if you are at one with God in love, the definitive answer is going to be a lot easier to both find and also understand than it would be if we stay in our current development where we're not yet at one with God, and therefore we've got to go through an experimental process to answer. And that's why I suggest to you, focus first on this, then all of these other answers will be so easy for you to discover in comparison. But what we're often doing is we're not focused on these and we want all the other answers first. And that doesn't make any logical sense to do that. Does that make sense? What makes more logical sense is for us to focus on the way in which we discover truth, which is this way, and then all the truths that we could ask questions about will be exposed to us through our use of our will to discover, but also because our soul will have the ability to understand the truth that as it's presented to us. Yeah. So that's my answer to that question.